I just think it'd be a way for us to keep the text in front of us. So they're just little bite-sized chunks every week, and you could memorize it and meditate on it for the week coming forward, and you could then be kind of present to the text in a way that's hard to do otherwise. And so that's just a little Easter challenge for you. So you'll find these texts, and this is an exercise of grace. So if you intend to do it, and then you find in the middle of the week or next time you've forgotten, guess what? There's grace for you. You can just do it for the next week. But it is a way, if you didn't understand what the discipline of memorization is for, it's not for gold stars in heaven. It's so that you can keep that text in front of you whenever you want to think about it. You carry it with you on your heart. So that's why we do it, and that's something that I think what might be a really effective exercise for the next few months. Okay? But today, of course, is Easter, and we are going to be looking at Luke 24, the road to Emmaus today. And in the book of Luke, there are two famous kind of travelogues in that gospel. That first travelogue begins in Luke 9, and it's the long journey from Galilee over 9 chapters all the way to Jerusalem. It starts in Luke 9:51, where Luke tells us as the time approached for Jesus to be taken to heaven, he resolutely set out for Jerusalem. So this was an effective choice. It's time for us now to go to Jerusalem. And from that moment on, we travel with Jesus through Luke, towns and villages, lots of miracles, lots of teaching times. And as he goes, he picks up a host of pilgrims. So he goes with his 11, and you find the contingent begin to grow, and they're all moving towards the city for the Passover. And Luke 19 through 23 tells us what happens when they arrive at the city. They're there for that week, the events of that fateful week. But the gospel does not end there. Luke tells one final travel story, but this time it's a road that doesn't lead to Jerusalem. It's a road that leads from Jerusalem, and that's in Luke 24, and that's the story we'll explore today. But to understand Luke 24, we first have to understand what was happening in the hearts of the followers of Jesus as they traveled towards Jerusalem on this first road. And as they travel, you sense in this contingent, the mood of Jesus' followers, this joy. They're ebullient. They're expectant. They're going to celebrate the Passover. There's a wave of building expectation. There is this expectation around Jesus that he is the one, perhaps the Messiah, the one who's going to redeem and deliver Israel. And that redemption had both political and spiritual and economic implications. So the Messiah was surely to get rid of Herod. Herod was the hated puppet king. And the Messiah would surely purify the temple and lead people back to the true worship of God. The Messiah would surely throw off the heavy yoke of the pagan Roman rule, releasing Israel to enjoy kind of new political and economic prosperity once again. And so you sense this in the people such that on the moment on that beautiful Sunday that he arrives, people line the streets and they begin to yell out these messianic phrases. And they begin to sing together. And they say, "Blessed be the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And what's interesting is as they sing these very powerful, pregnant phrases, Jesus does nothing to quell them. He doesn't shut them down. The anticipation had to build that week when the first thing he does is go to the temple and for that day shuts down, by turning over the money changers' tables, all temple sacrifice. It was a direct challenge to the high priestly authority. And that week, every day he goes to the temple and teaches, and there are huge crowds such that the people who are opposing him are afraid to do anything. They can't touch him. But that week that had started with such promise ended very badly. The hopes of Jesus' followers were dashed. After 4 days in the city, Jesus was arrested in the still of the night. He was secretly tried by a religious council. After only a few hours, this body of religious leaders made up of the most prominent Pharisees and Sadducees and the high priest himself convicted Jesus of a capital offense, blasphemy. And before the city had awoken from its slumber, Jesus had already been marched to Pilate, and they demanded his execution. Now, Pilate tried to resist. He sensed this man was innocent, But there was massive political pressure put on him by these religious rulers. And finally, he had to succumb to the political pressure, and he agreed to order his execution. And before that Friday was out, Jesus had been severely beaten. He'd been forced to march with a cross through Jerusalem to Golgotha, and he'd been nailed to that cross, where he would eventually, on Good Friday, suffocate to death. And Jesus' followers had watched as the life ebbed from him. And finally, they heard Jesus shout aloud, breathe his last, and saw his death confirmed when they threw a spear into his side. One follower, Joseph of Arimathea, was bold enough to ask Pilate's permission to take the body down. He'd done so quickly before the Sabbath had begun. He took the body, sealed it in his personal tomb, and they planned to finish full preparations later. Now, there may be no way for us to understand the terrible loss his followers had to feel after such a massive high, such an immense low. The man who was both profound teacher, bold prophet, and thought to be messianic king was now dead. Just imagine, on that Friday he dies, just 6 days into their visit. Just imagine what that Saturday was like. I mean, all their hopes had to be completely crushed. They had to be laid low, decimated. Imagine the shock and despondency and grief that they must have felt. But now it's early Sunday morning. They're together, comforting each other, mourning, but unexpectedly strange news begins to surface about Jesus. Women had gone to the tomb very early in the morning to finish preparing it for burial. But they'd found only an empty tomb. And what's more, they'd seen this vision of angels who told them Jesus had risen from the dead, just as he'd told them he would do. And those women had gone quickly back from the setting of the tomb and found the 11 disciples and the rest of the followers and told them that the tomb had been empty and what the angels had said. And Luke tells us that most of the people there just simply dismissed it as nonsense. Oh, they're overcome with grief. They don't know what they're talking about. But 2 of them believed it enough to run to the tomb and look inside. That was Peter and John. Now in chapter 24, Luke places us on a second road. This is Easter Sunday morning, and as I said, this road is not going to Jerusalem, it's going away from it. Tradition tells us that 2 of the larger group is leaving, and tradition tells us that one of them, the one named Cleopas, may have been Jesus' uncle. They're leaving Jerusalem and are traveling to Emmaus, a town about 7 miles from the city. And that's where we'll pick up the story. So if we'll have the screen for Luke 24. Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked among them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but did not find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." Now, the Greek words that Luke uses to describe the kind of conversation that these 2 men were having, this is energetic talking. This is debating, tossing around thoughts, ideas. But it's also obvious by their body language and the mood, and by the fact they're leaving Jerusalem. They don't believe the fact that Jesus has been resurrected. So they're stirred up by all these reports, but they don't really believe it. It's obvious that they don't believe it. Although there is much confusion as to what is happening, the dream is dead. Jesus is gone. They saw what he suffered. People don't come back from such things. And what they thought about him apparently wasn't true. He was just another prophet in a long line of prophets that when he spoke truth to power got squashed. It happened throughout the Old Testament. It happened to John the Baptist, and it happened to Jesus. Luke next tells us as they walked and talked with Jesus, Jesus catches up with them. But we're told that they were kept from recognizing Jesus. And as they walked together, Jesus asked them what they're talking about. Their reply is basically something like this. Have you been living in a cave? You were just in Jerusalem. There's no way you could have missed this. You must have missed. How did you miss the news about this Jesus of Nazareth? And they caught him up on all that had occurred in those last few days. Now let's hear Jesus' response. This is Luke 24, 25 through 27. He said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So there's no parsing these words. You don't need to know Greek. He basically calls them dull and without sense. He takes them to task for not understanding the ways the Old Testament had predicted the Messiah had to suffer many things and die before coming into his glory. And these two were not alone. None of their contemporaries had put together any of the Old Testament clues that God had given about the mission that Jesus had as Messiah to both suffer and die. Luke tells us that Jesus then walked them through all the seminal scriptures in the Old Testament that predicted the events of that weekend. I wonder which texts he used or what he pointed to. I wonder if he looked at the Passover lamb, and did he say to them, did you not understand? That was just a signpost pointing to something much larger. Did he reference the fact that the blood of animals can't make full propitiation for sin? Did he take them to Isaiah 53, that vivid description of how the suffering servant of Israel would have to suffer to take on the sins of the nation? Did he reference the Psalms and the prophets which had predicted many of the aspects of his death? Someday, in the life that is to come, I believe that our heavenly orientation will include a video of Jesus taking them through all those texts. And I would pay for that video right now a great deal. What a fascinating sermon he must have given them. Now, what happens next reveals that Luke knows how to tell a story. Luke 24, 28 through 29. And don't you love that graphic, by the way? I found that. I just thought, yes, of course. We have to have a kids coloring book up there to tell the story. 28. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. It's the close of day. The two have arrived at Emmaus. They realize that Jesus intends to go further. And the Greek tells us that they urged him, but they literally gave him no choice. No, you must come in and spend the night with us. Luke 24:30, Jesus agreed, and they sit down at a meal. When he was at the table with them, he took bread and gave thanks and broke it and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, it is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Now it's interesting, in this travelogue, Jesus actually was the guest, but he took the place of the host. And it was the host's job to bless the meal before they had it. And so he took bread and he broke it and he gave thanks and he distributed them. Now what does that language remind you of? It's the same language that's used to describe the Last Supper. As soon as he did this, Jesus' identity was revealed to them. What was it about the act that suddenly they saw Jesus? Was it the way he prayed? Those intimate terms that Jesus always used. Abba, Father. we gather and are so grateful for all your gifts. Daddy, you're so good to us. Was it the fact that when he broke the bread and raised it, they saw the nail marks in his hands? We don't know. What we do know is in a flash, they realize it's him, and just as quickly, Jesus is gone. And I imagine they sat in stunned silence for a few minutes before turning to each other and saying, of course it was Jesus. Weren't our hearts just burning within us when he spoke? It's like I was alive again. And they got up and left that very hour, returning to Jerusalem to tell the disciples and those with them that all the reports were true. They'd seen the risen Lord. And if we were going to read the rest of the story in Luke, we'd know it doesn't take long for Jesus to show up and demonstrate for the rest of the disciples by both letting them touch him and eating a piece of fish that indeed he was risen. Now, I could spend time talking about why I believe Jesus' resurrection is a historical reality. I could talk about the fact that these were all eyewitness accounts, that these are named people, these are known people. I could talk about the fact that many of these people would end up dying as martyrs. And they would die as martyrs saying to their dying breath that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. And I can tell you that in history, you don't find people dying for a lie. They only die for the things that they believe to be true. I could talk about the fact that while an individual can hallucinate, groups of people are never known to hallucinate the same thing. So groups of people could not, in their imagination, the figment of their imagination, can kind of project Jesus out there. I could talk about the fact that there is no other explanation for the explosion of the early church outside the fact that something monumental happened that weekend. But instead of these things, I want to concentrate on what happened on the road to Emmaus. You see, I can relate to the mood of those two disciples on the road to Emmaus. I too have had dreams die. And I too have had hopes crushed. And I too have had curveballs thrown at me. Perhaps not to the extent of these men, but I have had moments in my life when I walked around in a daze of confusion and despair. And so have you. For some of us, it may have been a death of a loved one. For others, it may have been a moment of deep rejection. For some, it may have been a moment when you made a huge mistake and the consequences were severe. For others, it may be a moment where you suffered physically. For some, it was a moment when you saw a dream die. For others, it was the moment you woke up at around 45 and realized you weren't going to be a rock star. These can be moments of great loss and grief and desolation and loneliness and anguish. What Jesus did for these men on the road to Emmaus is telling. The resurrected Lord resurrected their hope. The resurrected Lord restored something to them that had been lost. The moment they saw Jesus, something dead in them came back to life, and hope returned. Now, it's important to realize that the resurrected hopes and dreams of these men were not the same ones they had at the beginning. Their previous ideas of who Messiah was and what Messiah would do would never come to pass. And their ideas of what their lives would be like because of following him to Jerusalem also would never come to fruition. On that cross, one Jesus died and another one rose. On that cross, one understanding of Jesus' mission died and another arose. And on that cross, one understanding of their roles as disciples died and another one arose. In other words, the hopes and dreams that Jesus resurrected in his followers that Easter were fundamentally different than their original ones. They would never gain political freedom, but they would gain spiritual freedom. They would never achieve economic wealth, but it would instead they would enjoy the spiritual wealth of the kingdom of God and the presence of the Holy Spirit. They would never have men serve them, but they would be sent out to serve the world. Jesus has this habit of coming into our pain and offering to bring his resurrection power to bear in our lives. And when we say yes to him, when we open ourselves up to let him restore or redeem or speak to that thing that is so deep in us but is so broken, Jesus can bring his healing and restoration power to bear on our lives. And he will bring dead things back to life, but often in ways that are completely unexpected. And never in the ways that we thought he would do it. Isn't this exactly what we recognize when we flowered the cross today? We identified the ways that Jesus had redeemed and restored and resurrected some part of our life. For that thing to be redeemed, restored, or resurrected, it had to die first. There are 100 stories of Jesus resurrecting dead things on that cross today. And this is ironically the most powerful proof of the reality of Jesus' resurrection. It's not the logical or historical propositions where I prove to you through my sharp intellect of how we have to embrace the resurrection of Jesus as a historical reality. It's really the simple stories of people like you and me who've seen Jesus come in and heal and restore and resurrect something in us. It is simply the best explanation why today there are billions of people all over the world, people who look nothing like us and who think nothing like us, who are recognizing the same resurrection power that's touched your life has touched their life. Now, some of you today are on the road to Emmaus. And you feel that sense of brokenness deeply within you. You carry that dashed dream close to your heart. Your pain and confusion is fresh. And I ask you, is it possible that Jesus is just behind you on the road? Is it possible that he is going to catch up with you and speak a word that brings healing and restoration and renewal to that broken place in you? I cannot promise you that Jesus will give you back what has died in you. But I can tell you that he only gives good gifts. And I can tell you that he wants the very best for you. And I can tell you that what Jesus does resurrect in us can never die again. So it's my encouragement today, on this Easter Sunday, to bring your broken dreams to the resurrected Jesus today and see what he'll bring with them. What will he bring out of what has died in you? In a fresh act of faith, let us all come to him today, laying our lives before him and asking him to fill us in a fresh way with the power of his resurrection. And like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, let us let Jesus speak a word that makes our hearts burn within us. How should we do that? Well, it's not always typical to have communion on Easter Sunday, but we're going to serve it today. I want us to come to the table, and I want us to be ready to lay down our burdens, our pains, our disappointments, our despairs, and come with an expectation that Jesus wants to meet us at the table. And as we eat of the bread and we take the cup, allow Jesus to restore, heal, and renew, and maybe speak that word of hope into our hearts. And then as a token of faith, if we so choose, I'm going to invite you to take a flower either from the table or from the cross. And that flower is just simply to say that you have put your hope in Jesus and the power of resurrection. That today, you're claiming that promise and you're asking God to renew that thing that's broken in you. Let's stand together. Prepare your hearts now for communion. Maybe in this quiet time, you expose to Jesus today what has died, and you ask him to bring healing to that place. I have no interest in emotional manipulation, only in the honest interaction with human people with the risen Savior. Take space now to invite him into that place. And then, as we sing, and we'll take time with this, so there's no hurry, come forward, receive the elements. For those of you who are visiting, we invite you to the table. It's an open table. We take the bread and we dip it in the cup. We return to our seats and we take it together. So come forward, receive the elements, and as you feel ready, also you can take a flower on your way back.